Hi, everyone. Welcome. Pleasure to see all of you. This is the fall seminar series for the Cyber Policy Center, the last one for the fall, but don't worry, there'll be more in the winter quarter. My name's Dan Bateyko. I'm part of the team at the Stanford Internet Observatory. It is my pleasure to welcome Karen, my colleague Karen. Dr. Nershi is going to be speaking about how strong are international standards in practice, evidence from cryptocurrency transactions. Dr. Nershi is a postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford Internet Observatory and the Center for International Security and Cooperation. She completed her PhD in 2021 in political science from the University of Pennsylvania. She does brilliant work on ransomware, on cross-national regulation, regulatory arbitrage, international cooperation around cryptocurrency, and she'll be speaking today about some of her work. Karen, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. And today I'm presenting my job market paper, How Strong Are International Standards in Practice, Evidence from Cryptocurrency Transactions. So one of the major international financial challenges today relates to combating illicit financial flows. And by that, we mean that money earned through crime is integrated into the legitimate economy or laundered. And so anti-money laundering regulations help to limit financial flows to criminal and terrorist organizations, and they can also discourage future crimes from being committed. However, enforcing these anti-money laundering regulations presents a collective action problem. And this is true because regulation is costly for states that must pass and enforce new laws, and states cannot internalize the benefits of their enforcement. So therefore, anti-money laundering enforcement is a global public good. And success of these efforts, importantly, depends on international cooperation. So in this project, I measured the success of a recent cooperative international effort to regulate the cryptocurrency sector. And so cryptocurrency is a form of digital currency that was first introduced in 2009, and it has helped give rise to a new ecosystem of cybercrime, totaling $14 billion in 2021. And to put this into context, this is greater than the GDP of 66 countries in 2021. And this is in part because it offers a high level of secrecy. So in particular, people do not need to share information about their legal identity to transact cryptocurrency. They can do so using digital keys. And cryptocurrency also has a high potential for regulatory arbitrage. And by that, we mean that both individuals and businesses have avoided national regulation through the use of encryption and other measures to disguise where they're physically located to get around these national laws. So cryptocurrency presents a good case to measure international cooperation because of accessible data about cryptocurrency, and also because of the unique circumstances around the adoption of these standards for cryptocurrency. So in particular, a group of countries agreed to adopt similar standards and implement them within a given time period for a sector that didn't have much prior regulation. So you might wonder, why do we care about international cooperation and how well states are working in this particular area? Well, this project builds on some of my other dissertation research looking at international cooperation and anti-money laundering enforcement more broadly. And in my paper, Measuring Reputational Harm in Money Laundering Cases, I used the event study method to look at whether banks and states experience reputational harm following news of a money laundering case. And I do not find evidence that they experience this kind of reputational harm. And this is important because one of the theories out there is that states enforce these laws because they wish to safeguard their international reputations. So instead, this suggests that these laws are not actually self-enforcing. So states don't have a self-interested reason to enforce these laws. So if these laws are not self-enforcing, then you might wonder why so many countries have adopted them. And in quantifying international pressure, synthetic estimates of the economic impact of blacklisting, I look at the effect of a blacklisting process that was implemented by the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, which is an intergovernmental organization in the space. And using the synthetic control method, I find that countries that were placed on this blacklist experience decreased economic growth following this political process. So this suggests that international pressure has played an important role in leading countries to adopt these laws. So if the laws themselves are not self-enforcing and countries face intense international pressure to adopt them, this leads to the question of how well states are actually enforcing these standards in practice, and to the paper that I'm presenting today. And cryptocurrency here presents a unique opportunity to measure this international enforcement. So my research question is, to what extent have states successfully cooperated to regulate cryptocurrency? And it builds on prior work looking at the financial sector more broadly, so outside of cryptocurrency, that showed lapses by corporate service providers and banks in the enforcement of these types of laws. And to answer this question, I collected a data set of 150 million cryptocurrency transactions over a 2-month period in 2020. And I used bunching estimation to measure suspicious activity at the level of cryptocurrency businesses and provide country-level estimates. And so my results suggest that the recent international effort has made significant progress, but enforcement lapses across states continue to allow for regulatory arbitrage. So now let's talk a little bit about these new regulatory standards for cryptocurrency. So this effort has been spearheaded by the Financial Action Task Force, which once again is this intergovernmental organization that operates in this space and it's headquartered in Paris. And in 2019, the FATF issued new regulatory standards for cryptocurrency exchanges. And to understand what these exchanges do, we can imagine a scenario where there's one person with dollars and one person with cryptocurrency. And what the exchange does is it's a firm that acts as the middleman for these transactions and facilitates this transaction between the two parties. So these are important because once criminals commit cybercrime, they must convert cryptocurrency to fiat or government-issued currency. So if someone, say, sells weapons on the dark web and they receive a payment in cryptocurrency, they need to find a way to convert this to dollars or euros so they can use these funds more widely. And exchanges have been the primary way that criminals have done this. So they've used it to cash out cryptocurrency to this government-issued currency. So importantly, the 37 FATF member states agreed to implement similar standards for these exchanges by 2020. And here you can see the FATF member states. So as you can see, many of them are wealthy industrialized countries that are also in the OECD. So of course, the United States and also many European countries, but you also see that there are some developing countries here as well. So just to summarize the process, at the international level, we have the FATF that's issued new regulatory standards. And then at the state level, states are passing and enforcing national regulations. They're also training and equipping national regulators that oversee firms. And in this case, we're talking about exchanges that are implementing these regulations. So they're screening their customers for money laundering risk. And in this project, I focus on enforcement at the level of firms. And from this, we can infer something about what's happening at the level of states. So the quality of state regulation. So looking a little bit more at these regulations, they articulate two main obligations for exchanges. The first is that they must perform customer due diligence for transactions above a specific threshold. So this is a screening protocol by which exchanges collect and retain information about a customer's identity using reliable and independent sources of data. And the specific threshold at which they do this is mandated by law, and it also ties directly to the FATF regulations. So that in the EU, exchanges are doing this screening for transactions of 1,000 euros or greater. And in all other exchanges in other countries, they're doing them for transactions of $1,000 or greater. So for other fiat currencies, it's still being enforced in either dollars or euros, depending on the jurisdiction. So if a Japanese exchange is offering trades from Bitcoin to yen, it's enforcing it at the yen equivalent of $1,000. The second part of these obligations relate to performing risk-based measures. So these are measures aimed at identifying and assessing and taking active measures to mitigate money laundering and terrorist financing risks within an exchange. So these are proactive measures aimed at additional screening. And so as you can see, one of these obligations is very clearly articulated with a clear rationale for when to apply it, whereas the second obligation is more discretion-based on the part of both exchanges and regulators that are overseeing them. So importantly, exchanges face mixed incentives to enforce these measures. So on the one part, they're compelled by law to enforce them. They face potential fines or other measures should they fail to do them. But on the other hand, enforcement is costly. And some of these measures, especially the risk-based measures, may be hard for regulators to assess. So my overall hypothesis here is that exchanges will enforce customer due diligence, but they'll vary in how well they enforce these risk-based measures. From this, I draw a couple of predictions. So the first is simply related to seeing suspicious activity in regulated exchanges. So one of the hypotheses around these new standards, and particularly popular in the cryptocurrency community, is that the new regulation will actually drive criminals away from using exchanges and to more secretive alternatives. And the main alternative here is using peer-to-peer sites on the dark web to exchange cryptocurrency directly for fiat currency. And so the idea here is that maybe the regulation will actually make it harder for law enforcement to trace cryptocurrency connected to crime and see what's going on. However, I argue this is unlikely because of something called the secrecy security paradox. And this is common in the anti-money laundering literature more broadly. And the idea here is that money launderers are always facing a trade-off between the security of an investment and the secrecy that it offers. So even though someone might be able to, say, buy real estate in Lebanon and bribe officials to avoid sharing information about their identity because Lebanon is one of the most corrupt countries, that's not going to be a very attractive investment because for many other reasons, it's not a very stable country to try to invest in. So they're always facing these types of trade-offs. And in the context of cryptocurrency, these peer-to-peer sites are riskier and more difficult to use. So I predict that instead, criminals will likely respond strategically to the new regulations to avoid detection. And a second prediction here relates to enforcement by developed countries. So within the literature, there's a common hypothesis that developed countries do a better job of enforcing these laws than developing ones. And there are a couple of possible explanations for this. One is simply that they have greater capabilities, and so they're better able to enforce these laws. And another is that they really care about their international reputations, and they don't want to become known for having, say, a money laundering problem. And so they enforce these laws for that reason. However, several field experiments do not show that developed countries actually do a better job of enforcing these laws. So another prediction here is that developed countries will not show better enforcement of the new standards. Okay, so now we can move on to the data for this project. And a major challenge in measuring international cooperation more broadly lies in obtaining high quality and granular data. And so most firms that implement these specific type of standards, anti-money laundering laws, like bankers or lawyers, are very secretive with their customer data. So cryptocurrency exchanges, by contrast, publicly share information about their transactions. So this provides a great opportunity to collect information for this project. However, there is a caveat, which is that the main source for getting this data is from third-party sites that aggregate data from exchanges. So they basically act as information clearinghouses in the cryptocurrency space to collect and share this information about exchanges. However, there is a concern here, which is of risk of fake data. So in particular, the exchanges are sharing information about their transactions with these third-party sites. And they've also been known to share information about fake transactions because there's an incentive here for exchanges to appear that they have a great volume of transactions and they have a high level of liquidity, which will allow them to attract more customers. So one report estimates that as much as 95% of all transactions reported to these third-party sites are actually fake data. So to address this risk, I bypass these third-party sites altogether and I collect the data directly from exchanges. So to do this, I collected transactions using each exchange's application programming interface or API. And I automated this data collection using remote servers between June 22nd, 2020 and September 2nd, 2020. So it's a little bit more than 2 months worth of data. And I collected data from 67 exchanges that offer trades from Bitcoin or Ethereum to fiat currency. So these are the two major cryptocurrencies, and I'm collecting basically all the transactions being offered from these two major cryptocurrencies to fiat currency during this time period. And each transaction includes the time, date, quantity of cryptocurrency, and the exchange rate between the particular cryptocurrency and the fiat currency. So the raw data includes 158 million transactions. And after cleaning the data, I'm left with 47 trading pairs across 9 countries. And so by trading pair, I mean a specific combination of cryptocurrency to fiat currency. So it could be Bitcoin to dollars or Bitcoin to euros, for example. And even though we're down to 9 countries after doing the data cleaning, after removing sort of these low volume exchanges, it still includes an interesting cross-section of countries involving industrialized countries, several developing countries, and a tax haven. So moving on to the empirical strategy. And once again, the goal here is to measure countries' cooperation to enforce these common standards. And to do this, I estimate suspicious activity within exchanges, and I define suspicious activity as behavior consistent with efforts to avoid screening. And specifically here, I exploit a threshold at which exchanges are required to screen their customers for money laundering risk. And I use bunching estimation to quantify the amount of suspicious activity I'm finding across exchanges. So bunching estimation is a method used to study phenomena involving avoidance or evasion. And it employs a massive distribution to measure how individuals respond strategically to a change in incentives. And it was first used to study how individuals respond to changes in tax rates, but I adapted here to use it in this context of cryptocurrency transactions. So to give you an idea of how this works, we can look at a graph here. And here we imagine that we have some smooth distribution of trades, where the x-axis here is the different fiat amounts of the transactions. And if we have some sort of incentive here at Z star, where people have a reason to sort below this, then what we can see is that people sort their transactions below it, and we get this bunching here characterized there. And as a result, the distribution beyond Z star is shifted downwards. So we get this empirical density that's lower than the counterfactual density. So now we can look at this method using real data from an exchange, which is Binance US. And as you can see here on the x-axis, again, we have the dollar values. And at the red line here, we have $1,000, which is the threshold. So the first step is to divide the data into $10 or euro bins. And then next, you fit a polynomial to the distribution, excluding a specific range below Z star, where you think that the bunching is going to happen, because you don't want this estimate to be biased by the actual bunching that you're trying to measure. And then next, I estimate the excess mass in this bunching region relative to the average height of the counterfactual distribution. And then I calculate standard errors using non-parametric bootstrapping. So now that we've gotten this, we can look again at some real data here, which is from Binance US. And as you can see, this fit line here, this red line, seems to fit the data pretty well, and we don't really seem to see bunching happening below the threshold. And this is borne out in the estimate here of bunching, which is 0.04. The standard error is 1.96, so there's no statistically significant bunching. And we don't really see bunching happening in this exchange. On the other hand, we have data from another exchange called CoinMetro. And as you can see on the x-axis, we have these values in euros, and there are a lot of transactions happening right below 1,000 euros, which is the threshold. And this is borne out in the estimate of bunching, which is 58.8. And the way to interpret that is that there are 59 times greater transactions in this region below the threshold than we would expect based on the rest of the distribution. The standard error here is 8.36. So this is statistically significant at the level of P is less than 0.00001. So here, we have a good example of bunching. So now that we see that sometimes we find bunching, what does this bunching suggest? So first of all, it just shows that there's an incentive to sort transactions below the threshold. And so I argue that in turn, this suggests that exchanges are enforcing the screening at the threshold, and this creates the incentive for users to sort their transactions below the threshold. But the persistence of this bunching over time suggests that exchanges are not actively performing risk-based measures. So they're not taking the extra steps to really screen their business for unusual activity and try to address these suspicious trends. So importantly, bunching is not necessarily evidence of criminal activity. However, I argue that most lawful users are going to be unlikely to avoid screening. And this is true because the costs of undergoing screening are relatively low. So you just need to share a little bit of information about your identity. Usually it just takes a few minutes, and then a user is clear to conduct transactions at any amount after that. And second of all, avoiding screening can require specialized knowledge. So in particular, the person needs to know that the threshold is being enforced. They need to know if it's being enforced in dollars or euros. In some cases, they may even need to know a specific exchange rate. So if I'm trying to convert Bitcoin to dollars in a UK-based exchange, I'd also need to know the exchange rate of dollars to euros to make sure that I'm keeping my transaction below the threshold. So regardless of whether the activity is criminal or non-criminal, bunching is suspicious, and it represents a lapse in enforcement of these risk-based measures. So on the other hand, what does a lack of bunching suggest? So it shows that there's no incentive to sort transactions below the threshold. So this could be actually for one of two reasons. So the first reason could be that the exchanges are actively enforcing risk-based measures. So they're doing a really great job with additional screening below the threshold. And so no one's really trying to get around these regulations. So we don't see bunching. But we could have a kind of opposite situation happening here, which is that exchanges are doing a really poor job of enforcing all the measures. So not only are they not doing great with risk-based measures, but they're not even doing screening above the threshold. So there's really no incentive for people to sort below it because they're not afraid of screening above it. So I argue the second explanation is unlikely because national regulators can pretty easily verify whether exchanges are performing customer due diligence. And they can do this by checking their records to see if they're keeping records of these transactions above the threshold. So I'm about to show you the results. And in this, I compare bunching below $1,000 or euros and regulated and unregulated countries. So FATF versus non-FATF. I compare bunching below placebo thresholds of $500 and $1,500 or euros in these regulated exchanges. And I compare bunching with exchanges aggregated by country for Bitcoin to fiat transactions. So it allows us to compare across countries. Okay, so moving on to the results. As I mentioned, I collected data for FATF countries, which are regulated, and non-FATF countries, which are unregulated. For each of these, I collected transactions from Bitcoin and Ethereum. And for each of these, I grouped the trading pairs according to whether the exchange enforces the threshold in dollars or euros. So we have 8 groupings here at the bottom. And so here you can see the results. And I want to draw your attention first to these bottom rows. And so this shows you the number of exchanges included in each estimate and the number of trading pairs. And then if we look at the left-hand side of the screen, we can see the estimates of bunching below the threshold for these trades from Bitcoin to dollars, Bitcoin to euros, Ethereum to dollars, and Ethereum to euros in these regulated exchanges. And what we see is that there's positive and statistically significant bunching across all of these pairs. So this means that in Bitcoin to dollar trades, we're seeing 5 times greater the number of transactions below the threshold than we would expect based on the rest of the distribution. And it goes down to about 1.5 times greater transactions in these Ethereum to dollar transactions. So on the other hand, when we would look at the potential bunching in unregulated exchanges for these same trading pairs, here we don't see any statistically significant bunching. So there's nothing strange happening below what would be the threshold in these unregulated countries. So this suggests that there's something different here about these FATF countries. And I would argue that it's the way that they're enforcing these regulations. So maybe there's just something weird going on in FATF countries where we happen to see bunching below round fiat values. So I also checked these 2 placebo thresholds of $500 or euros and $1,500 or euros. And you can see here that there is some statistically significant bunching, some positive, some negative, but we're not really seeing a consistent pattern here of bunching in one direction or the other. We can also look at the results by country. And so once again, looking here at this middle row, which is bunching below the actual threshold, what we see is that there are statistically significant bunching in many of these countries. So starting with Estonia on the left-hand side, again, there are 59 times greater transactions below the threshold than we would expect. Brazil, they're about 7 times greater. Japan's exchange is about 5 times greater. Australia, 3 times greater. And then the British Virgin Islands, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands, about 2 times greater. And also there are 2 countries here without any statistically significant bunching. And I'll look at both of those in turn. So first in the United States, we're not seeing any statistically significant bunching. And actually the US is unique in this case in that exchanges in the US actually perform screening as soon as they register new customers. So there's no screening below above a threshold because everyone's already screened. So sort of consistent with this, we don't see bunching in this case. So on the other hand, in Turkey, we also don't see bunching. And here, actually, we can't really distinguish between the 2 possible explanations that I mentioned to you before, which is either really great screening or, really poor screening. But in a future project, I'm hoping to try to figure out what's going on in these kind of unique cases like this. So we also look at these placebo thresholds and we see some bunching, some statistically significant bunching here and there, but again, there's no consistent pattern here that's really standing out. So I obtained similar results for Ethereum to fiat trades grouped by country. My main findings here are bunching in FATF countries, no bunching in non-FATF countries, no consistent bunching below placebo thresholds, and bunching across many of these FATF countries. So all of these findings are consistent with the interpretation. These countries are enforcing part of the new standards, but there are lapses in how well they're enforcing these risk-based measures. Okay, so moving on to the discussion. And once again, I find evidence here of suspicious activity within regulated exchanges, which is given by this bunching method. And it suggests that individuals are responding strategically to the new regulations, and this affects how these regulations function in practice. And this is important because prior research has considered problems with the implementation of anti-money laundering laws by both countries and businesses, but prior research hasn't really considered the role of individuals and how they might respond. So this suggests that policymakers should take into account this role of individual strategic behavior when designing these types of laws. And there's also a policy proposal here, which is that randomized screening by exchanges would work better than thresholds. because with randomized screening, an exchange can receive a notification of when it should screen a customer, whereas this threshold-based screening, it's much clearer to people trying to avoid it, how they can avoid it by keeping their transactions below a threshold. So second of all, looking at enforcement by developed countries, and I do not find evidence that developed countries do a better job of enforcing these laws than developing ones. And I draw this conclusion based on the fact that FATF countries, both developed and developing, perform similarly. So we saw bunching across many of these countries. So substantively, this point is important because developed countries handle larger transaction volumes than developing ones. And this is true in the financial system more broadly. It's also true in this cryptocurrency specific context that I look at. So here you have the dollar values of the statistically significant bunching that I measure during this 2-month period. And as you can see in Japan, the bunching value was about $215 million. It was about $86 million in the British Virgin Islands, $74 million in the United Kingdom, about $2.5 million in Brazil, down to $300,000 in Australia. So you can see here that Japan was handling a much higher volume, and so we have a higher dollar value of the bunching that we see there. So if, as an international community, we're interested in addressing suspicious financial flows, suggests that we should really pay attention to enforcement by developed countries because they're handling such a large volume of transactions. And normatively, this point is important because developed countries often have greater power in international organizations, including the FATF. So they've played a big role in shaping the dialogue around anti-money laundering enforcement at the international level. And in particular, there's been a lot of focus on failures by developing countries as sort of part of the broader narrative. So to conclude here, I find that FATF countries have made meaningful progress in regulating cryptocurrency. However, enforcement lapses continue to allow for regulatory arbitrage, and developed countries also struggle to enforce regulatory standards. So that concludes my presentation for today. Thanks so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, so I'm going to be taking questions from the room. Oh, yeah, let's move this here. I'll take some questions from the room and then as well as from the Zoom. And so I'll just be paraphrasing the questions in the room so that people on Zoom know what you all are asking. So let's start. Does anybody have any questions? Fellow in the back.
Which non-FATF countries do you find are most viable for want to avoid?
So the question is, what non-FATF countries are most viable for avoiding regulation?
What is it that makes whichever countries are most viable? What is it that makes them that way?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So one of the things about this cryptocurrency space is that it changes a lot over time. So I think the countries in my non-FATF sample are probably different from the countries that we see today with the sort of major non-regulated exchanges. So there are other alternatives, but I guess I would highlight, once again, there's this sort of challenge at play, which is the security and the secrecy paradox. So for example, Binance has several like country-specific exchanges, but just the broader Binance exchange, I believe, is registered out of Timbuktu. So it's not being regulated. So there are alternatives like this, but the thing that's sort of key to this and probably is going to continue being even more important in the future is that these unregulated exchanges are oftentimes riskier. So we've just seen a very big meltdown in the FTX space. And we can see that when we have these unregulated entities, it's riskier. They've been some of these have been subject to hacks and thefts where customers have just lost access to their funds. So I guess to summarize, there are some of these alternatives, but they're a little bit riskier. So I think over time we're going to see that these are, appear to be even riskier. So that's kind of the incentive to gravitate toward regulated exchanges.
So there are no countries that stand out to be more attractive?
Yeah, not particularly. I mean, so part of the architecture as well here is that exchanges are very secretive about where they're located. the unregulated ones in particular. So several exchanges have tried not to disclose any country where they're headquartered. So Coinbase has tried that approach. Binance has tried that approach in the past. So yeah, I think it's not so much about like particular countries as it is just just kind of choosing a place where they claim to be located.
So at least in the charts that you showed, it seems like the assumption is that this function is going to occur right before. Is there a reason why we can assume some potentially really large and if so, if that is possible, would this approach have that as well?
Yeah, so it's true. You have to identify this range where you think bunching is going to happen. So I used $100 below the threshold. I also test $75 below the threshold because it's not really clear exactly where the grouping is going to happen. So I test a couple of these. It's true that people could be breaking into even smaller transactions. Say, if you want to make a transaction of $1,000, you could easily do like $499 and $500 or so. So that's a possibility as always. I think that looking at bunching, so the reason why people might want to choose these higher amounts is it can just make it easier, especially if you're trying to make transactions of like large volumes of currency. Then when you're doing these higher amounts, it just means that you need to do fewer of them. So it's a possibility to do even smaller amounts, but I think what I'm capturing here is just sort of the low-hanging fruit. So even with this option to do even smaller amounts, we're still capturing a lot of bunching, like in this range of about $100 below the threshold.
Okay, we had a question over here.
Yeah. You mentioned that one of the reasons why the suspicious is that there's low cost for higher levels of protection. But I can imagine that maybe customer try to put that cost on the customer by charging a higher fee above the level where they need to do due diligence. It could be the other kind of factor for have you any idea maybe exchange did that?
Yeah. So the question is, do exchanges impose costs onto their users, onto transactions as a way to do this kind of regulation?
Yeah, so as you're pointing out, one of the factors for using bunching is there needs to be no other policies happening around this threshold. And so also at the exchange level, there can't be any policies that might incentivize people to keep their transactions below this. So indeed, I look at the fee structure of these exchanges, and they're usually based on percentages. So sort of flat 2% fee, no matter what size your transaction is. So I have checked the policies for the exchanges, and there's nothing here that would incentivize smaller transactions. If anything, you usually get a break if you're doing a bigger transaction, because sometimes you get a break in terms of the fees that you're paying. So yeah, nothing exchange-based that's going to encourage transactions below this threshold.
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, you said that 90% of the data might be wrong to go through the pairing process, but I would assume that they would also use the API of their makers. What gives you the confidence to assume that your data is not the same with raw that would be this?
Yeah, so sometimes the numbers are just reported to these third-party sites. So I think that this is less reliable than actually collecting from the APIs and seeing what that is. However, it's not a 100% guarantee that going to the APIs, all the data that you get is going to be quality data. So one of the steps that I take as well is I looked at the distribution of each of these trading pairs across exchanges from the data that I collected. And for actually about 4 of these exchanges, the trading data looked really wonky. So usually you look at these distributions and there's bunching happening at some round numbers, and it's just sort of messy looking. But for a few of these exchanges, it looked sort of like a perfect exponential distribution. So I thought that this was very suspicious, and you're seeing the same pattern across multiple trading pairs in these exchanges. So I didn't include those 4 exchanges in my analysis. And I talk about that a bit more in my paper and show some of these distributions. So collecting the data from the APIs is not a guarantee that all the data is going to be good. But I, did take several steps to try to ensure the quality of this data. So yeah, I think given these steps, it offers us greater certainty that the data we're working with is good data.
We have a question from the Zoom from Christabel, asking if you can provide any detail on patterns or data on crypto trading observed in developing countries. Was that part of your collection at all? If you have any more insight into that.
Yeah, so there are a couple of developing countries that I collected data from, including Brazil. Turkey is sort of, something of a developing country. So there are a few of these. I think as far as an overall trend, a lot of times you see transactions at lower amounts. So whereas, these exchanges in other countries, EU countries, there are transactions of lots of different amounts, including high amounts above $1,000, going up to 2,000, 5,000, 10,000. In developing countries, it seemed that many of the transactions were lower amounts, say like less than $500. But other than that, I didn't really see any trends that really stood out in developing countries.
So I had a question. I'm going to use my moderator's privilege on this. So it seems like states are scrambling to find regulations that are effective. And you started out by saying that there's costs, that it can be costly on the exchange. So I want to think about the frontier here and like what kind of policy recommendations that might come from this work that you're doing for exchanges. You had mentioned one might be these kinds of randomized screenings. What might other policy choices be for better enforcement?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with that. Definitely randomized screening is something that's basically free to implement. You can just use the computer system that tells you when you should screen a customer or not. So that's just sort of a first step that seems like it would help a lot with this problem. And sort of related to that, you can choose, if there are certain areas where you're more worried about, money laundering risk, like privacy coins or something like that, you could enhance your screening in these areas that you're worried about. So that kind of stands out. I mean, in general, I would say it's of course a very challenging problem to try to address. The compliance industry is a pretty huge industry, but I think to the degree that exchanges can try to evaluate some of their efforts using actual data, that's of course really going to help in this space. And I think the compliance industry overall hasn't done a great job with actually evaluating how effective their measures are. And I think cryptocurrency, I look at it in this case, but it's actually a sector that's fairly well positioned to do well in terms of addressing things like money laundering risk, in part because there's so much open source data, there's so much data available on the blockchain that you see a lot of, you see academic researchers like myself looking at this data, but then you also see a number of security related companies that have come into the space that try to analyze suspicious trends and track illegally connected cryptocurrency. So I think, just sort of data-driven analysis will be really helpful, and the cryptocurrency sector, I think, is well positioned for that.
Right, and you had mentioned some privacy coins or some other kinds of cryptocurrencies that you might want to look for additional suspicious activity. Do you want to maybe spell that out a little bit more for those in the room who are unfamiliar with the kinds of cryptocurrencies out there and what kinds of pairings might include some more suspicious activity than others?
Yeah, sure. So definitely originally, or in the last, say from 2017, most of the illegal activity, most of the crime connected to cryptocurrency was actually handled just in Bitcoin. And there were even people that you can find several years ago that were saying that Bitcoin is untraceable. So I think it's coming into the public consciousness as there are more and more of these cases that it's not actually untraceable. If governments are willing to put effort into tracing cryptocurrency connected to crime, they can oftentimes uncover a lot of information because you have this record going back for years. So as tracing has become more common in Bitcoin and people are becoming more aware of that, you see criminals turning to more secretive alternatives. So one of them is this idea of privacy coins, which are really designed to obscure information about what's going on, what the transactions are. That's one alternative. sort of the difficulty for money launderers there is that there isn't a very big volume of activity happening in these privacy coins. So that makes it harder for them to try to act undetected. You'll also see money mixing services or tumbler services spring up, where the idea is that people send their cryptocurrency to these services, and they mix a lot of transactions together and create a block with a lot of different transactions going into it. So this makes it much harder on the other end to track where this cryptocurrency has been. So when someone's trying to follow the the trail of these transactions and they get to money mixing, it becomes harder to follow it on the other side. So if people are connected to this sector, they might have heard about Tornado Cash, which was recently a service that was sanctioned by the US government. And the concern here was that they were aiding in this money laundering by helping to mix these transactions. So yeah, there are new sort of more secretive alternatives springing up as people gain more knowledge about the sector.
Questions in the room? Yes.
Oh, yeah, thank you for your great presentation. Really interesting. I've had a couple of it's in the chart you presented, two countries seem to stand out as off the chart, one being Estonia, one being Japan, and I just wondered if you had any more granular explanation of those two. And the second, if I'm understanding the research properly, it seems like the bulk of your attempt to analyze whether it's based on transaction data. And I wonder if there's also just outright data on enforcement from these countries that is usable and quantifiable.
Yeah, so to your first question about the specific countries that were really high. And so as we saw, Estonia had a very high magnitude of bunching in that. But actually, so this is concerning, of course, but it was actually only from one exchange. And so then when I presented the dollar value of what the bunching was actually worth, it was lower in terms of the dollar value. I think it was about $400,000. So it's concerning, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Japan was also very high. So, we can't really say definitively why this is. Japan has been an early mover in this cryptocurrency sector, and they have had a number of sort of crises in the space. So they've had exchanges that were hacked with very large amounts of money stolen, and this has played a big role. So yeah, we don't know conclusively why this is, but some other evidence suggests that there's some amount of risk or issues in trying to regulate in Japan right now. As for your second question about actual data from countries about enforcement, so there have been a couple of other reports, including from the FATF, that try to evaluate how well countries are doing. So they don't have anything along the lines of, arrests or maybe suspicious reports or anything like that from the cryptocurrency sector. In general, it's really hard to work with these types of statistics from states because you never know what the underlying level is. So maybe one country does 100 arrests related to money laundering and another country does 50, and you don't know if the country that did 100 arrests is doing a really great job, or maybe their baseline is huge and they're not actually doing a great job. So that's kind of the difficulty with looking at the state side. But we'll see in the future. I mean, it would be great if states kind of turn to more data-driven evaluations in the space.
I think we have time for one more question. Okay, no more questions. Please join me in a round of applause for Karen. So that concludes the fall quarter for the series, but we have the winter seminar series coming up. So mark your calendars, January 10th. We'll have a posting for all of the speakers out in the new quarter. I want to thank Ben, David, and Michelle, and the whole Cyber Policy Center team putting on these talks. And then thanks again, Karen, for your talk today.